Today's interview is part of a series of videos by the Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities, or CAMPACK, including with supporters of the campaign and those who can contribute to the wider discussion of excessive securitization of our societies and the misuse of terror and other legislation. CAMPACK brings together human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, and communities which find themselves targeted by so-called anti-terrorism legislation. The Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities was formed by local communities and human rights groups in March 2001 in response to the banning of 21 organizations under powers granted by the Terrorism Act 2000. Kurdish, Baloch, Tamil, Basque, and Sudanese and Kashmiri communities all came together to form CAMPACK as an umbrella group, together with organizations including the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, State Watch, the Institute for Race Relations, Campaign Against the Arms Trade, also known as CAT, and the civil liberties legal firm Bernberg Pierce. CAMPACK organizes public meetings, petitions, parliamentary lobbies, submissions to parliamentary bodies, as well as protests at court hearings and prisons. Our guest today is Jonathan Bloch. Jonathan studied law at the University of Cape Town and the London School of Economics. He was politically involved in South Africa in the worker and student movement during the apartheid era and remains active in human rights circles in the UK. From 2002 until 2014, Jonathan chaired the Canon Collins Educational and Legal Assistance Trust, one of the largest scholarship awarding organizations in South Africa. He was also councillor in the London Borough of Haringey from 2002 until 2014, elected as a Liberal Democrat. He owns and runs a worldwide financial information business across 4 continents. Jonathan co-authored the books British Intelligence and Covert Action, KGB CIA Intelligence and Counterintelligence Operations, and Global Intelligence, the World's Secret Services Today. He was also co-author of 3 chapters in the collection Dirty Work 2, the CIA in Africa. Jonathan is a trustee of the civil liberties monitoring group State Watch, which provides excellent legal and policy research and analysis of civil liberties and human rights related issues and laws across Europe and the UK. He's also on the board of the Campaign for Freedom of Information, which was launched in 1984. It has pushed for better public access to public records and has drafted numerous private members' bills which were introduced in the UK Parliament. Some of the most notable successes were, or are, the Access to Personal Files Act of 1987, Access to Medical Reports Act 1988, Environment and Safety Information Act 1988, and Access to Health Records Act 1990. They've also pushed for reforms to official secrets legislation in the UK, including reducing what was the incredibly wide scope of what could be deemed to be a criminal offense under the law. Unfortunately, much of that, it appears, will be undone with the National Security Bill 2023, which is currently being pushed through Parliament at the moment, but perhaps that's a discussion for another time. Most famously, perhaps, the Campaign for Freedom of Information played a leading role in bringing the Freedom of Information Act into existence in the year 2000. Finally, Jonathan is also a member of CAMPACK's own steering committee. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.
So, Jonathan, we only have a limited time for this discussion, and our focus today is on so-called terror legislation. But I wanted, if possible, for you to very briefly speak about the work of the Campaign for Freedom of Information. Specifically, why is it important that all of these laws providing rights to access to information be pushed through in the first place? And how is it that relevant today, not only for campaigners, researchers, and journalists, but for everyday people as well?
Sure, by all means. So the reason why freedom of information is so important is that historically Britain has been a very secretive society. You had a small ruling class who did not want light to be shone into the dark corners of government. And for many years, there was resistance for the disclosure of any information. The Labour Party, before it was elected as New Labour, had the Freedom of Information Act, the passing of it, in its manifesto. And it finally got passed by the Blair government. Tony Blair has since indicated that this was the worst legislation that he ever introduced. It, however, has severe limitations. It, for example, excludes the intelligence agencies and the security services, while in other jurisdictions, such as the United States, they are included, but then the data can be redacted. In the UK, it is a wholesale exclusion. Nevertheless, the Freedom of Information Act has opened up to the public and journalists vast array of data which previously was not disclosed. If you want to know how the National Health Service is performing, if you want to know what quangos are doing, if you want to know what certain ministries are up to, you can use the Freedom of Information Act. Even with the limitations of the multitude of exemptions, it has still allowed significant amount of information to come out. So, for example, the whole MP expense scandal would not have happened had somebody not submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, although ultimately the data was leaked separately. And it's been very important for campaigners, particularly when you have things like medical malpractice, you have people locked up and miscarriages of justice. People have managed to use the Freedom of Information Act to prize out information about policies and similar cases, etc.
Yes, and I'd actually add to that a substantial amount of information that's been gleaned about the inner workings of the CPS and the Metropolitan Police Service during the ongoing case of Julian Assange has come from successful and ongoing Freedom of Information Act battles, not least of which initiated by the Italian investigative journalist Stefania Morizzi. But well, that then brings us to the next point, more specific to the topic of today, which is terror legislation. So since the year 2000, the UK has passed at least, I believe, 16 pieces of legislation aimed, we're told, at tackling, curbing, and preventing terrorism. Could you give us a brief overview of the history of terror legislation in the UK?
Sure. So until 2000, most of the legislation was directed towards, inverted commas, the troubles in Northern Ireland. But with the Good Friday Agreement being concluded, there was a feel that they should consolidate this legislation and give it an air of permanence. At the same time, there was also a sense that the establishment wanted to deal with restive communities, people who came from areas where they were striving for national self-determination. So in 2000, the first Terrorism Act was passed, which consolidated existing legislation. And you must remember this was prior to 9/11. Subsequent to 9/11, there'd been a whole series of legislation, always tightening up certain areas, but in some areas having to give some leeway because of public protests and by the court striking down the legislation. So if you want to take two areas where there has been change over the years, you could look at the introduction of control orders, which were initially aimed at non-British nationals. And these were then subject to a lot of criticism and adverse court hearings. And they were then replaced by another measure. And these, over the years, have slowly whittled down. And as far as I can ascertain, there are about only 2 people now subject to these provisions. Then we can also look at detention without trial. So this has gone up and down over the years, again, because of public protests, the courts regarding the extension beyond the normal period as being unconstitutional. but they are still today 14 days compared to the normal 4 days in normal criminal proceedings. What the terrorism acts have done over the years have derogated from the concept of the rule of law. So on the one hand, there is the notion that terrorism threatens British values. But on the other hand, precisely these terrorism acts destroy British values, which is about fairness, accountability, trial by a jury, and no arbitrary measures. But over the years, the focus of the terrorism laws has also changed. So from detaining lots of people, lots of searches being undertaken, it has moved more to the control of entry and staying into the country. So you've seen many more deprivations of citizenship, withholding of passports, rather than other arbitrary measures such as stop and search and detentions. So the number of, say, Section 7 interrogations at airports has gone down significantly from in 2011, say 60,000, just over 60,000, to now just over 2,500. But at the same time, the number of people having their nationality deprived or their passports removed has gone up significantly. So there's been a shift. But the overall impact has been to intimidate and harass communities. People are scared to voice their opinion. People are scared to raise money, even for humanitarian purposes, because they are concerned that they might be branded as a supporter of a terrorist organization. Often people think of the banned terrorist organizations as things like Al-Qaeda. But in fact, most of them are national liberation organizations striving to obtain political freedom in far-flung countries. And that's where one sees the major impact. The impact of intimidation, the impact of people being scared to articulate their opinions, etc. If you look at what the impact of terrorism in Britain has been, in the years from 2003 to 2022, only 93 people have been killed, according to government statistics, as a result of terrorism. That is 93 too many. Let's make that absolutely too clear. People have the right to life. But the reaction to that has been overblown and has affected people's civil liberties.
And as you point out, the main foundational legislation, the Terrorism Act 2000, was passed 2 years after the Good Friday Agreement was signed in Northern Ireland, and a year before 9/11 happened as well. So that actually perfectly leads on, segues to the next question, which I think you've largely addressed. But you may have a bit more to say on the matter, which is how do these laws, which are ostensibly designed to tackle terrorism, relate to the notion of criminalizing communities? Because CAMPACC was originally formed in opposition to the UK Terrorism Act 2000. Is there anything else you have to say about the connection between the criminalization of communities on the one hand and the terrorism laws on the other?
Sure. So because in the popular mind, terrorism has become associated with certain groups over a period of time, this has led to those communities being subject to increased surveillance and scrutiny. So this was the situation with respect to the Irish from the 70s to the mid-90s. Then subsequent to 9/11, it was the case of adherents to the Muslim faith, who suddenly all became under suspicion because of the acts of a few individuals. So you had a whole community scapegoated based on their beliefs, their dress, their practices, etc. And this led them to be increasingly marginalized from the rest of the community, who did not make subtle distinctions between different people and different political outlooks.
Yeah, well, thank you. And there's also the fact, I know that the Kurdish community were a particularly strong force in the founding of the campaign against criminalizing communities, because the Kurdistan Workers' Party, based in Turkey, after years of lobbying by the Turkish state, ended up becoming prescribed as a terrorist organization in the UK, as it was in the United States as well, which meant that in the case of the PKK, which is not just a political party, it is a social movement, it's a political movement. It has support across villages and towns and cities throughout various parts of Kurdistan, including in Turkey, which means that any level of support for the PKK or for the idea of either a separate state, as they had originally sought, or even a democratic autonomy within Turkey, which is now what the PKK strive for, that can result in people becoming criminalized here in the UK as well. And the same is true for Tamils, Sri Lankans, Palestinians as well, now that various Palestinian groups, including the PFLP, more recently, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, the PFLP was added to the terrorism list.
Well, I mean, what the terrorism acts have been used for as partly to prop up regimes which the British government favors, and has been used as a foreign policy weapon, as it were. So along with this terrorism acts also goes collaboration with these countries' security services, and allows those security services to keep tabs on their domestic opponents who live in the UK. So overall, it allows Britain to buttress and bolster authoritarian governments, such as in Turkey.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's less of a tool about tackling terrorism and more of a tool to allow British foreign policy to continue unhindered, basically, to make it more difficult for people to criticize British foreign policy, especially if it's associated with a country that they have come from or their parents or grandparents have come from.
Well, let's put it this way. Every country in Europe, like Britain, has common law which prevent and punish, quite rightly so, violent acts of murder, assault, etc. There is no need for additional laws. We have sufficient statutes on the statute book which cover acts of violence. So the terrorism acts are there for a political purpose rather than to actually deal with criminal behavior.
That's a fair point. Finally, Jonathan, where are we headed now in terms of law and policy in the realm of civil liberties, human rights, and national security legislation, if we can call it that?
So in some ways, the whole terrorism notion has faded from the public eye. And what you now have is a more generalized clampdown on civil liberties. And you've seen that with the Public Order Act, hastily passed just before the coronation, the arrest of the chief executive of Republic and some of his colleagues before they even got to the demonstration. Plus, for example, there was recently a court case for Stop Oil, where the accused was not allowed to state the justification for the acts that they had taken. So we see a growing authoritarian trend where effectively protest is now outlawed, because anything which causes a nuisance can be stopped by the police and people arrested. And frankly, protests are there to be disruptive and cause a nuisance, because that's how people get noticed.
Sorry, go ahead.
So effectively, peaceful protest has been outlawed or subject to severe restrictions. And we should all be concerned about that.
And people who want to know more about the nature of the latest restrictions on protest generally should visit the website of the Network for Police Monitoring, or is it Police Monitors, netpol.org, I believe it is, which is an excellent resource, actually. And they have also a long historical view of the laws and how they've been applied. They provide constant advice, both for protest observers, legal observers, as well as protesters themselves. And with that, Jonathan, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to speak to us. I'd also like to thank Marco of Open Protest Network for his work on ensuring the video production side of things goes smoothly. And of course, thank you to all of you watching. Please do share this video to anyone you think may benefit from it. Future videos with other interviewees will also be published in due course. People can learn more about the organizations which have been mentioned, including CAMPACC, the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, State Watch, the Institute for Race Relations, Bernberg Pierce, and the Campaign for Freedom of Information, as well as CAT, the Campaign Against Arms Trade, by visiting their websites.